Book 2, Volatilism on Resilience, The Forge of the Will. Chapter 1, The Immutable Will, Endurance as a Divine Mandate. James Stockdale. A man is not defeated when he is beaten. He is defeated when he accepts defeat. The story of James Stockdale is not just one of survival, but of resilience forged in the crucible of suffering. His ordeal reveals a fundamental truth. While the body may be shackled, tormented, and broken, the will remains untouchable when aligned with the divine. Volatilism asserts that the will is not merely an internal faculty, but the unbreakable conduit between the individual and the eternal, a force that transcends the limitations of the flesh and the illusions of the material world. Stockdale's defiance against his captors, his refusal to submit, and his ability to transform suffering into a battlefield for the mind serve as a living testament to the core principle of volatilism. Resilience is not a reaction, but a state of being. It is not something one simply has, but rather a mode of existence one must cultivate, an alignment with the divine will that renders the self unshakable. This chapter seeks to integrate the principles of unyielding endurance into the volatilist framework, establishing resilience not just as a psychological tool, but as a spiritual imperative, a divine mandate that we, agents of the eternal will, must embody. The hierarchy of control, recognizing the immutable core. A fundamental misalignment of perception occurs when one identifies too closely with the body. The flesh is a temporary vessel, subject to the whims of nature, genetics, and external forces. It acts independently of our conscious intent, performing thousands of processes we do not control. It can be injured, grow sick, and eventually decay. To place one's identity solely in the body is to build a fortress upon shifting sands. Yet within us exists something untouchable. The mind and will exist beyond the domain of physical law. They are not bound by material limitations, nor can they be conquered by external force unless willingly surrendered. While pain, illness, and confinement may afflict the body, the will remains sovereign, a pillar that stands unshaken amidst the storm. Volatilism asserts that true strength is not found in mere physicality, but in the unwavering refusal to surrender the mind and will, for in them resides the fragment of the divine. To endure is not to passively suffer, but to actively transmute adversity into strength. The immutable core of the volatilist. The body is a vessel, subject to decay, harm, and external force. It is not you, only the form through which you operate. The mind is a battlefield. The enemy may seek to implant doubt, despair, and submission, but only you can decide what takes root. The will is divine. It is the eternal link to the absolute, and so long as it remains aligned with the divine will, it is untouchable. It is only when one forgets this hierarchy, when one mistakes bodily suffering for total defeat, that the will is lost. But for those who remember, there is no force in existence capable of breaking them. Endurance as a mode of being. James Stockdale did not merely survive his captivity. He weaponized suffering to become stronger. He refused to let pain, isolation, or despair sever him from his will. In this, he exemplified the volatilist approach to endurance. Endurance is a mindset, the reframing of suffering. If you are suffering, it is because that God deems you strong enough to bear it. Endurance is not merely a reaction to suffering. It is a chosen stance, a conscious alignment with the unshakable will. A volatilist does not passively endure hardship, but actively reframes it. Pain is a test, an opportunity to prove one's fortitude. Isolation is a sanctuary, a chance to cultivate absolute self-reliance. Adversity is a forge, shaping the self into something greater. Stockdale did not perceive captivity as a meaningless torment. He recognized it as a proving ground for his will, where his enemies held no power unless he granted it. Volatilism asserts that one must not wait for suffering to end, but rather meet it as a challenger and reshape it into a source of strength. Reality is what you accept, the primacy of perspective. The enemy controlled my body, but my mind and will were untouchable. The external world does not dictate one's reality. Perception does. The moment one accepts defeat, suffering, or hopelessness as absolute truths, they become real. But for those who refuse to accept conditions as final, reality bends before the unyielding will. A prisoner who believes himself free cannot be broken. A man subjected to pain who refuses to grant it meaning renders it powerless. A warrior who sees death only as a transition fights without fear. Volitism teaches that one must never accept external circumstances as defining factors of existence. To claim sovereignty over one's perception is to claim sovereignty over reality itself. True power lies in the ability to suffer without breaking. The moment you accept suffering as fuel, you transcend it. Weak men fear pain because they see it as an affliction. The volitist embraces it as an ally. Those who avoid suffering at all costs remain weak and fragile. Those who confront it learn to reshape it into power. Those who transcend it become untouchable. Stockdale's survival was not built on blind hope. It was forged through active engagement with suffering. He did not merely endure pain. He met it, studied it, and refused to let it dictate his identity. This is the essence of the volitist approach to hardship. Pain is an offering, and those who accept it become greater than they were before. Pain is temporary. Honor is forever. To submit is to lose the self. To endure is to remain whole. There is no greater loss than the surrender of the will. A man who yields to suffering loses not only the battle, but himself. A man who stands unbroken, even unto death, remains eternal. Stockdale chose suffering over submission because he understood that physical pain passes, but the integrity of one's will is immortal. A volitist must make the same choice. To resist, even when resistance seems futile. To endure, even when the body begs to break. To uphold the will, for it is the only true possession one has. To suffer for a cause greater than oneself is not a burden. It is the highest form of alignment with the divine will. And in that, the volitist becomes indestructible. Conclusion: the unyielding volitist. Stockdale's story is not just one of survival. It is a blueprint for the reclamation of the immutable will. To suffer and endure without breaking is not merely a skill. It is the essence of volitional mastery. And this book integrates his lessons and the lessons of other figures we will encounter into the very core of volitism, establishing that the body is temporary, the will is eternal. Reality is what you accept. Never yield to false narratives. Suffering is power. Those who embrace it transcend it. Pain is fleeting. Honor is forever. A volitist is not one who merely withstands hardship. A volitist is one who transforms adversity into will, suffering into strength, and captivity into victory. The body may fall, but the will is eternal. Thus, let it be written in the canon of volitism: there is no suffering that cannot be transmuted into power, no hardship that can shatter the immutable will. Chapter 2. Musashi is the ultimate embodiment of self-mastery through relentless will. His story isn't just one of skill, but of total mental, physical, and strategic dominance. A man who honed himself into an unstoppable force. Musashi, the indomitable swordsman. Early life and the birth of an unyielding will. Musashi's origins are shrouded in both legend and history. Born in 1584, he was raised in an era of samurai warfare. By the age of 13, he fought and killed a trained samurai in single combat. This was not luck. This was the emergence of a force of will so strong that it would shape his entire life. Unlike many samurai who followed rigid schools of swordsmanship, Musashi was an outsider, a ronin who rejected traditional dogma. He forged his own path, defining mastery on his own terms. The Unbreakable warrior. 61 duels, 61 victories. Musashi's true legend was carved through his duels. Across 61 battles, he was never defeated. His most famous duel against Sasaki Kojiro is a masterclass in volition. Kojiro was the greatest swordsman of his time, wielding a longer blade with a superior reach. Musashi arrived late on purpose, psychologically unbalancing his opponent before the fight even began. Instead of traditional katana, Musashi carved a wooden sword from an oar and still killed Kojiro with one strike. This wasn't just swordsmanship. This was a total control of the self and situation, the will bending reality in Musashi's favor. The philosophy of an unyielding mind. Musashi's later years were devoted to refining his mind as much as his blade. He wrote the Book of Five Rings, which wasn't just about fighting. It was about mastering all things through discipline and adaptability. Think lightly of yourself and deeply of the sword. Ego is the enemy of mastery. True will is externalized into action, not self-obsession. You must understand that there is no more than one path to the top of the mountain. The will is not bound to one method. True mastery is adaptability. Do nothing that is of no use. Volitional efficiency. Eliminate wasteful action, thought, and emotion. Musashi's ultimate test. Mastery beyond combat. In his final years, Musashi lived in seclusion, meditating, writing, and refining his philosophy. He died sitting in the Zen posture of meditation, as if death itself was simply another moment to master. His life was not just about fighting. It was a testament to volitional mastery in all aspects of existence. Lessons in will, Volatus practice from Musashi. 1. Train every day with ruthless discipline. Mastery is not a moment, it is a lifetime. 2. Master multiple disciplines. The will must be adaptable. Stagnation is the enemy. 3. Remove all excesses, physical, mental, and emotional. True will is pure, focused energy. 4. Control the battlefield before the battle begins. Reality bends to those who impose their will upon it. 5. Accept death and fear nothing. Fear of loss, pain, or failure weakens the will. Face all things head on. Musashi was the embodiment of volitional mastery, unyielding, unstoppable, a pure force of will, a force of pure will and nature made of flesh. Musashi and the fusion of microcosm and macrocosm. Musashi's greatness was not merely in his physical prowess, but his ability to perceive reality as a unified whole, aligning his eternal will with the greater forces of existence. Unlike other samurai who followed rigid traditions, Musashi understood that true mastery was not about technique alone. It was about becoming one with the way itself. The void and the way, Musashi's esoteric understanding. In the Book of Five Rings, Musashi ends with the mysterious Book of the Void, where he speaks of transcending duality. By knowing things that exist, you can know which does not. When your spirit is not in the least clouded, when the clouds of bewilderment clear away, there is the true void. Here, Musashi is describing absolute clarity of perception, a state where one is no longer bound by illusion, hesitation, or ego. This empty mind, Mushin, allows him to move without obstruction, reacting to battle as if he were nature itself. This is the Volutist ideal. When one masters the inner realm, thought, fear, hesitation, desire, the outer world ceases to resist them. The external world becomes an extension of their will. Mastery of self equals mastery of the blade equals mastery of the universe. Musashi's swordplay was an extension of his mind. His mind was an extension of the universe. He reversed the light inward, understanding that battle was not won through aggression, but through absolute presence. He never struck first. He let his opponent reveal themselves, allowing their own flaws to defeat them. He adapted instantly. He did not follow rigid patterns but flowed like water, aligning himself with the forces of nature rather than resisting them. He moved beyond swordsmanship, becoming an artist, a strategist, a poet. His will was not confined to combat, but permeated all existence. This is the essence of Volatus alignment. Musashi did not seek to control reality through brute force. Instead, he harmonized with it while imposing his will upon it, fusing self-determination with the natural flow of existence. Musashi's death, transcending form, returning to the void. Musashi's death was not one of sickness, nor of despair. At the end of his life, he sat in the lotus position, sword beside him, eyes closed, and simply left this world as he had lived, fully in control, fully present, fully aligned. He did not resist death nor fear it. He had already transcended form. He had become the void itself, a perfect fusion of will and the way. Lessons in will. 1. Empty the mind. Fill the universe. The more you cling to thoughts, doubts, and fears, the more they obstruct you. True volition is clarity, a mind free from hesitation. 2. Flow with the world. The world is not an enemy to be conquered, but a force to be mastered. Adapt, adjust, and align. 3. Train all things, become all things. Musashi mastered swords, painting, poetry, and strategy. Mastery is not singular, it is total. 4. Die as you lived, unbroken, unyielding, aligned. When the end comes, fear nothing. If you have lived with an indomitable will, death is simply another step on the path. Final thoughts. Musashi as an archetype of the Volutist warrior. Musashi was more than a warrior. He was a living embodiment of volitional mastery. He did not simply defeat opponents. He saw through reality itself. He trained his inner self until it was as refined as his sword, and in doing so, he became something greater. A force of nature, an entity of pure will moving through the world. Musashi shows us that mastering the microcosm, inner world, is not separate from mastering the macrocosm, outer world. They are the same. Those who conquer themselves conquer the universe. Musashi did not fight the world. He became it. Chapter 3. Through Fire and Shadow. Frankl and the Volutist Forge of the Will. The Crucible of Suffering. Before Viktor Frankl became a towering figure in existential psychology, he was a young Austrian psychiatrist navigating a world on the brink of collapse. Born in 1905, he developed an early fascination with the meaning of human resilience, themes that would later define both his philosophy and his survival. But it was in the concentration camps, including Auschwitz, where Frankl's theories were not just tested, but forged in suffering. Stripped of his profession, possessions, and even his family, he faced the rawest confrontation with the human condition. In Man's Search for Meaning, Frankl describes moments that would break most minds. Watching prisoners collapse from exhaustion, enduring brutal labor, suffering the loss of loved ones without time to grieve. Yet in the abyss of suffering, he made a choice to see himself as the master of his own inner world, no matter how broken the external one became. Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. This act of volitional defiance, choosing how to suffer rather than being passively destroyed by it, is the foundation of both Frankl's philosophy and Volutism itself. Unlike many who surrendered to despair, Frankl reframed suffering as a space where one could assert their will. This was not mere endurance. It was an active self-determination in the face of oblivion. The reclaimed will. Frankl's ability to endure was not just psychological. It was volitional mastery in action. While others collapsed under the weight of meaninglessness, he transformed his suffering into a vehicle for self-transcendence. He found purpose in He found purpose in comforting fellow prisoners, offering them words of encouragement. He clung to the imagined presence of his wife, proving that love and meaning could exist even in absence. He envisioned himself standing before an audience, lecturing on the psychology of suffering, actively constructing a future beyond the camps. Each of these acts was a direct assertion of will over the simulacrum of suffering. Where the web of simulacra and modernity lulls people into passive despair through excess comfort, the camps forced Frankl to the opposite extreme, a confrontation with suffering so absolute that he had no choice but to actively forge meaning or be obliterated by nihilism. Those who have a why to live can bear almost any how. This is why this deeply volitional act of defining meaning became the core of his survival. He was not waiting for meaning to arrive. He was generating it through the sheer force of will. Logotherapy and volitism, the will beyond meaning. Frankl's logotherapy argues that the primary human drive is not pleasure, Freud, for example, or power, Adler, for example, but meaning. By helping patients find purpose, he believed they could transcend suffering. Volitism, however, takes this further. Meaning is not just something we can discover, it is something we can create. Where logotherapy emphasizes finding purpose, volitism demands forging it, consciously shaping it as an act of will. Key synthesis of logotherapy and volitism. 1. From passive discovery to active construction. Logotherapy, meaning is discovered through reflection and action. Volitism, meaning is deliberately constructed through volitional intent, even in defiance of circumstances. 2. Beyond survival, meaning as a weapon of will. Frankl used meaning to endure suffering. Volitism weaponizes meaning not just for endurance, but for expansion, to break beyond limits, not just withstand them. 3. The praxis of meaning forging. Reframing suffering as a challenge to overcome rather than something to endure. Using symbolic resonance to embed meaning into daily rituals and choices. Developing a personal mythology that makes suffering part of the epic volitional narrative rather than an arbitrary burden. Suffering ceases to be suffering at the moment it finds a meaning. This is where volitism refines logotherapy. Instead of merely finding meaning in suffering, we bend suffering to our will and alchemize it into a force for spiritual transformation. Frankl taught us to endure. Volitism teaches us to transcend. Conclusion: the forge of the will. Frankl's journey through fire and shadow is more than just a testament to human resilience. It is an instruction manual for the volitist path. He proved that suffering is not just an obstacle, but a crucible, a forge in which the will can be reforged into something unbreakable. But where Frankl stopped at survival through meaning, volitism demands something greater, not just to endure suffering, but to spiritually transcend. Chapter 4. Sifan Hassan, the Unyielding Will. Sifan Hassan's story does not begin on the Olympic stage, nor on the track, nor even in the world of athletics. It begins in adversity, in displacement, in the unfamiliar. Born in Ethiopia, she fled to the Netherlands as a refugee at the age of 15, alone in a world that had already thrown her into uncertainty. Many might have crumbled under the weight of such an uprooted existence, but Hassan did not. Instead, she ran. Her rise in athletics was not a story of privilege, nor was it one of gradual, calculated progression. It was the manifestation of an iron will, one that could not be dictated by circumstance. She was not merely a talented runner. She was an athlete who defied every conventional limitation imposed by the body, mind, and the world. Hassan would go on to accomplish what no other runner, man or woman, had ever done. At the 2020 Tokyo Olympics, she sought to win the 1500, 5000, and 10,000 meter, an impossible triple that required mastery of speed, endurance, and sheer unrelenting resolve. No one had dared to attempt it before. No one had ever won Olympic medals across these distances in a single games, but Hassan did. In her opening heat to the 1500 meter, she fell, tripped by another runner. The race should have been over. The body, the mind, both would tell any rational competitor that it was time to give up, to conserve energy for the next race. But Hassan did not yield. She got up, chased down the entire field, and won. This was not merely a display of skill or fitness. It was the will in its purest form, unyielding, absolute, refusing to acknowledge limitation. She would go on to win gold in the 5,000 meter, gold in the 10,000 meter, and bronze in the 1,500 meter, securing her place as one of the greatest athletes in history. In Paris 2024, she would go on to do the unimaginable, securing another gold medal, this time in the marathon, demonstrating her uncanny ability to dominate a wide range of running disciplines from lower middle distance to upper long distance. Not only that, she picked up 2 more medals in 2024, adding bronze medals to her collection at 5,000 and 10,000 meters, making her possibly the greatest athlete in history. But her story is not just one of records. It is a lesson in the transcendence of the will. Transcending mind and body. Distance running is not just a sport. It is the arena where the fundamental battle of existence plays out. The body reaches a point where it begs for rest. The muscles burn, the lungs strain, the heart pounds. The body, on its own, will always demand surrender. But then, even the mind joins in. It rationalizes stopping, whispering that enough has been done. There is nothing left to prove. This is where most people stop. But there is something deeper, something beyond body and mind. The will, proving its transcendental primacy even over the mind. Realizing, recognizing, and actualizing its true purpose is a link, a conduit to the divine, accessing unlimited potential. Hassan spoke about reaching this state, a place where pain and fatigue become irrelevant, where she is no longer listening to the body or the mind, but something greater. This is the threshold where true volitional mastery emerges. In these moments, the individual ceases to merely be a person running. They become a conduit for the divine. This is why running has long been linked to spirituality. The famed runner's high, a trance-like state experienced in prolonged endurance. It's not merely chemical. It is the moment when the will fully overrides the limitations of the flesh and thought. It is the realization that there is no difference between the one who runs and the act of running itself. It is the ultimate flow state. Hassan embodies this realization. In her races, she does not merely push past pain. She enters a realm where pain is no longer relevant. She does not merely push past exhaustion. She becomes something beyond exhaustion, becoming a conduit for the divine. The will, when fully harnessed, is not just the force that allows us to persist. It is the bridge between the self and something greater. In volitism, this is the key to transcending the web of simulacra, to stepping beyond the conditioned mind and reclaiming our direct connection to the divine will. Hassan's running is not just an act of athleticism. It is a manifestation of the divine in motion, a demonstration that when the will is unshackled from limitations, it channels something far greater than the individual, a gestalt where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. When she fell in the 1,500 meter and rose again to win, she was not just running a race. She was embodying a truth. The will does not break. The will does not stop. The will is absolute. And in this, she becomes a model not just for athletes, but for all those who seek to reclaim their volitional mastery. To run as Hassan runs is to live as the volitist lives, unyielding, transcendent, and wholly attuned to the divine will. Chapter 5, The Unyielding Will, Terry Fawkes and Rick Hansen. I just wish people would try to realize that anything is possible if you try. Dreams are made possible if you try. Terry Fawkes. There is no finish line. Rick Hansen. The shattered body, the unbroken will. 2 men, 2 bodies broken by fate. 2 spirits that refuse to kneel. Terry Fawkes was 18 when osteosarcoma claimed his right leg. The doctors told him he would never run again. Rick Hansen was 15 when a car accident severed his spinal cord. They told him he would never walk again. The world had spoken. Their lives would be small, confined by their injuries. They refused to listen. In a world where simulacrum teaches passivity, where most people accept their imposed limits, these men saw through the illusion. They recognized that the body is only a vessel. The will is what commands it. And when that will is tethered to something greater, even broken and shattered flesh cannot stand in its way. The decision to defy fate. Pain is a great equalizer. It makes most men retreat. But for those who have touched the divine will, it becomes fuel. Terry Fawkes, in the sterile white halls of the cancer ward, watched children suffer and decided he would run across Canada to raise money for research. Not a short run, not a sprint. He would run a marathon a day, every day, on a prosthetic leg. Rick Hansen, after years of rehab, refused to see his wheelchair as a prison. Instead, he saw it as a chariot. He would push himself, not just through his hometown, not just through Canada, but across the world, proving that movement, life itself, was still his to command. Both men did not just endure their hardships, they weaponized them. They transformed suffering into action. They moved forward, step by agonizing step, because stopping was never an option. The impossible undertaking. Terry Fawkes ran for 143 days, covering 5,373 kilometers, essentially a marathon every single day, on one leg. Rick Hansen wheeled himself over 40,000 kilometers, crossing 34 countries, climbing mountains, pushing through deserts. Every mile was a war. Terry's prosthetic leg was not built for running. Every step sent jarring shocks through his bones. The pain was constant, yet he kept going. Rick's journey was a trial of endurance. Roads are not made for wheelchairs. Hills that seemed insurmountable. The strain on his arms, the exhaustion, the doubts. He kept pushing. But it was not just stubbornness that drove them. It was something deeper, something few men will ever touch. Alignment with a will beyond themselves. Terry spoke often of an unseen force, a drive greater than his own. He did not run for himself. He ran for something far beyond him. Rick, too, saw his mission as a cause, not just a feat of endurance. They did not act as individuals, but as vessels of something higher. And that is why they succeeded where others would have faltered. The breaking point. Every journey of the reclaimer has its moments of reckoning. The point where the body screams enough, the moment when continuing is madness. For Terry, it came when the cancer returned. His lungs were failing, yet he tried to keep running. He had to be forced to stop. Even in his hospital bed, he still wanted to move forward. For Rick, it was the moments of despair, the times when his body begged for rest, when every push forward was a war against gravity. Yet he did not stop, because stopping would mean surrender. Their suffering was not meaningless. It was the crucible in which their will was aligned and purified. The legacy of the indomitable. Terry Fawkes never crossed the finish line, but his journey was not in vain. His legacy raised over $1 billion for cancer research, a fire that still burns today. While his body succumbed to the battle with cancer, his will won the war. Rick Hansen completed his Man in Motion tour, redefining what was possible for people with disabilities, proving to the world that limits exist only in the mind. They rewrote reality itself. Volatil's principles embodied. 1. The transcendence of the body. The will, when properly aligned, overrides physical limitations. The body flows where the will commands. 2. Purpose-driven suffering. Suffering without meaning is torment. Suffering tethered to a higher cause is transformation. 3. Endurance beyond reason. Comfort is a pacifier. Pain is a forge. The reclaimer must learn to push beyond what the mind believes is possible. 4. Faith in the higher will. Those who move in alignment with something greater than themselves can achieve the impossible. The challenge to the reclaimer. Terry Fawkes and Rick Hansen looked at the chains imposed upon them and shattered them. They refused to be confined by fate. What chains still bind you? What limits have been placed upon you by the world, by your mind, by the web of simulacra? Break them. Move forward. The divine will does not bow to circumstance. Neither should you. Chapter 6. The Endurer and the Conqueror of Limits. The wind howled across the frozen abyss, a relentless force stripping flesh of warmth and thought of certainty. Before them stretched the unknown, a vast, merciless expanse where survival bowed only to those who imposed their will upon it. Two figures stood at the threshold of this oblivion, their breaths thick with frost, their gazes fixed upon the infinite. One was the Endurer, a man who bent but never broke. He had known the long night of despair, the weight of frost-bitten limbs, the agony of leading men through starvation and icebound desolation. He had stood at the precipice of death and whispered, "Not yet." The other was the Conqueror of Limits, a man who did not merely resist suffering, but sought it out. His victories were not mere survival, but in defiance of thresholds. He had tested the body's breaking point and forced it beyond. He had rewritten what men believed possible. Between them stood a great and terrible void, the trial of ice. They moved forward, step by step, forging their path through the frozen wasteland. The Endurer walked with measured patience, every action deliberate, every movement conserving energy. He had led men through hell and learned that survival was not about brute force but calculated persistence. A man is not judged by how far he goes, but by what he can bear without breaking, he said. The will is not in conquering the land, but in outlasting it. The Conqueror scoffed. Outlasting is submission disguised as resilience. If all you do is endure, you are the ice, unchanging, frozen in place. The will is proven in force, in conquest. I do not endure the ice, I make it kneel. He pressed forward, forging without hesitation, his body a weapon honed against the elements. Where the Endurer moved with patience, the Conqueror of Limits moved with sheer, violent intent. But the ice does not care for philosophy. The storm swallowed the horizon. The wind became a wall, the cold living thing that stripped reason from the mind and sensation from the flesh. In its wake, only the will remained. The abyss of the mind. In the storm, the world ceased to exist. There was only the howling void, the suffocating weight of nothingness pressing against the soul. Here lay the parallel to the mind, the true battleground. The mind, like the frozen unknown, was treacherous and without mercy. Those who wandered blindly were consumed. Those who fought without wisdom found themselves lost. The Conqueror pushed forward, every fiber of his being resisting the force of nature. He raged against it, refusing to kneel, until exhaustion clawed at his bones. The Endurer knelt, not in surrender, but in strategy. He anchored himself, conserving his fire. He had faced storms before. He knew they passed. The mind breaks when not in the gale, but in the unprepared soul, he whispered. But the Conqueror would not yield. He had conquered limits before. This would be no different. Yet his strength, his weapon, was blunted in the face of the abyss. The storm does not acknowledge defiance. For the first time, he hesitated. Integration, the reclamation of the will. It was here, at the edge of collapse, that understanding dawned. The two were not adversaries, but halves of the same whole. To endure without conquest was stagnation. To conquer without endurance was destruction. The will required both. The Endurer reached into his depths and found the fire of the Conqueror. He rose, stepped forward, not with patience alone, but with intent. The Conqueror stilled his reckless charge, adopting the patience of the Endurer. He pressed forward not through force alone, but through measured resilience. Together, they emerged from the storm. The path forward. Volitional mastery is neither passive endurance nor blind conquest, but the synthesis of both. The mind must be endured when it rages against itself, when despair whispers of surrender, but it must also be conquered, pushed beyond its known limits, forced to bow to the true will. The Endurer survives the void. The Conqueror of Limits refuses to accept it. But only together do they traverse it. And so must we. Chapter 7. The Defiant Flame and the Unbroken Oath. The world is a prison for the unawakened will. It binds with laws unwritten, chains unseen, and walls so vast they are mistaken for the horizon itself. To break free is to risk annihilation, to step beyond what is permitted and declare oneself sovereign. Few dare, fewer still succeed. And yet, throughout history, there have been those who refused to kneel, who stood in open defiance against the forces that sought to own them. Some fought in the shadows, wielding fire against the monolith of control. Others stood upon the scaffold, their bodies broken, but their spirits unbowed. Among these, two figures rise. One, a whisper of rebellion in the dark. The other, a war cry that shakes the heavens. The kindling of rebellion. The cell was damp, the air thick with rot. Shackled to the walls, his body a ruin of pain, the prisoner did not tremble. He had been caught, betrayed, dragged before his captors like an animal. But he had not broken. Guy Fawkes had failed, and yet in failure the fire remained. What was this all for? The torturer sneered, pressing ink and paper before him. Write your confession, sign your name, submit. His body screamed for relief. His hands, shattered by the rack, could barely hold the quill. And yet, through the agony, he smiled. They did not understand. Submission is an illusion. They could take his flesh, but not his will. He had not fought for the success of a single act. He had fought because resistance is an end in and of itself. The flame of defiance does not die with the man. It is passed on, igniting others. The simulacrum could crush him, but it could not control him. With his final strength, he scrawled a name. Not his own, but a shadow of it. A ghost, a refusal, a reminder. Then, when they laid him in the gallows, he did not let them claim even a spectacle of his death. He leapt from the scaffold, snapping his own neck before the executioner could touch him. The simulacrum demands submission, but the defiant flame chooses its own fate. The war cry of sovereignty. The battlefield was silent, the banners hanging limp in the morning air. The man stood alone, chains around his wrists, the weight of empire pressing upon his shoulders. Kneel, they commanded, confess treason and beg for mercy. William Wallace had no mercy to beg for. He had fought, not for a throne, not for land, nor for the favor of the kings. He had fought because no man has the right to own another. They tore him apart. First they stripped him of his armor, then they tore at his flesh, drawing out his death, waiting for him to scream, to beg, to weep, to acknowledge that the crown was greater than the will. But the will was not made of flesh. He did not cry out. He did not submit. And when the moment came, when the last of his strength was slipping away, he forced air into his lungs and roared a single word: freedom. The simulacrum demands obedience, but the unbroken oath defies, even in death. The final truth of volitional liberation. The world will always seek to shackle the will. It will tempt with comfort, coerce with fear, and crush with force. It will whisper that submission is survival, that resistance is futile, that sovereignty is impossible. But the defiant flame knows it is better to burn than to be owned. And the unbroken oath knows to die unbowed is to live free. This is the final truth of volitional liberation. First, the inner rebellion must begin, the quiet, unyielding fire that refuses to be subdued. Then, the open defiance must rise, the full declaration of sovereignty, even at the cost of everything. To awaken is to refuse the chains. To reclaim the will is to declare war on the simulacrum. And to be free is to choose death over submission, not in body, but in spirit. Let them chain the flesh. The will kneels to none.